All right, so I had the drama of fire and ice yesterday, getting out of Brussels, a fire at the central station, getting here, the snow. Let's hope this journey that we're going to go on goes a little bit smoother than the last one. So thank you very much for having me, first of all. It's a beautiful part of the world. I wish I could also see it without the snow. What I'm going to do in the next 45 minutes is, I hope, help you understand that we actually are slightly addicted to waiting for the future to be predicted. And actually what we can do is actually not be so passive and actually be more creative and active in the way we shape our future. I mean, after all, that's why you're all here. You're engaging in a process which is about the future of your region. And so in regional development, we quite often look at the future actually by looking backwards, and I'm going to encourage you to look at the future, engage with it by looking forwards. All right? And I'm going to start by talking about the future in the way most people talk about it in terms of trends, and then I'm going to move on to talking about it in terms of the different methods you can use to shape the future. So prediction is not only hard, I would say prediction is impossible. Niels Bohr, famous physicist, said prediction is hard, especially about the future. And our world is shifting faster and more fundamentally than ever before. I mean, there are lots of things that are continuously taking us by surprise. I've put up things like the great financial crisis of 2008 took a lot of people by surprise. The fact that we now have these very global businesses of Airbnb or Uber or Facebook, which didn't exist 15 years ago. 10 years ago, presidents didn't tweet. Now we wish they didn't. And we seem to be facing the prospect of nuclear war again after a long impasse of not having to think about it. So the world is changing very fast, it's changing very fundamentally, and we are continually surprised by it. When people talk about the future, they tend to talk about trends. I'm going to present 4 sets of trends and the most common ones that are talked about. The trends specific to your region, I don't know a lot about, but I hope you know a lot more about them than me. So people trends, demography. People are living longer, right? There are more people over the age of 80 in Japan than there are under the age of 16. I don't know what it's like in this region, but in Japanese, I think the parties are really poor. We're more connected than ever. I think there's 4.2 billion people across the world connected by mobile phones or mobile devices. Of course, that means there's still 3 billion people not connected at all. We're more urban. The world's population is increasingly urban and will be predominantly urban by 2050. And we are more multi-generational. We now have 5 generations living side by side in the workplace or in homes, right? This is phenomenal in the human story of evolution. We were used to having children, parents, and grandparents. Now we have children, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents, all living at the same time. And the world is less equal, and that's been surprising, because we've had an unprecedented era of growth and a really phenomenal era of global growth since the 1990s. But even with that growth, the world has become more unequal, and that has been surprising. And the story of people is not that we're becoming more similar, but actually that we're becoming more socially complex. And we're becoming more complex because we're connected not just by global changes, but by the ability to become ultra-local. We can now tailor our own news. We can now choose who we connect with. We can continually reinforce the world and pick up signals about the world we would like to see, rather than the reality around us. There is less common sense than there has ever been. There is a lot of individual sense, but less common sense. Planet. People talk a lot about climate change. We've just had the COP23 in Bonn. Climate change, greenhouse gas emissions building up in the atmosphere. Even if we achieve the Paris Agreement, as I'm sure you know, we will still see the world 2.7 degrees centigrade warmer than it was in pre-industrial times. That is unprecedented in the history of humanity. We passed the 400 parts per million volume, which is the highest ever level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, in May 2016. Human beings have never lived in this type of environment before. But it's not just climate. We have a water crisis building in many parts of the world. By 2030, over 40% of the world's population will live in areas of water stress. And water stress doesn't just mean too little. It also now means too much. That we have a lot of flooding that's happening in cities that hasn't happened before, or in rural areas. So it's not just too little water, it's too much water, too little water, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and of the wrong quality. That's what we mean by water stress. And people are talking about planetary overshoot. The Stockholm Environment Institute measures a lot of what they call the planetary boundaries: nitrogen, phosphorus, water, climate. And they say that we're exceeding more and more of these planetary boundaries. And this is a concept of planetary overshoot. That by 2050, we will need 2 planets to live on if we continue to build the current rates of consumption. Or we'll have 1,000 people living on 1 planet. We'll have 6 billion people living on less than 1/100th of a planet. And that's the inequality story again. Economy and technology. What we're seeing, there's a lot of hope around something called the 4th Industrial Revolution. Have you heard of the 4th Industrial Revolution? The prospect of automation and digitization and the new growth. But what we're actually seeing at the moment is a slowdown in the global economy. We're seeing lower levels of investment than we've ever seen before. Yes, we have the rise of robots, but they're removing an awful lot of jobs rather than creating a lot of work. We have digitization, and we have the prospect of artificial intelligence. Now, we have general artificial intelligence, which means routine tasks can be taken over very quickly by a machine. So if you're an accountant, it's bad news. But if you're somebody who cleans a hotel room, it's pretty good news, because the complexity of your task is still so great that it would take a long time for a robot to substitute for you. So automation and AI are not universal in their impact in the workplace, they're very differentiated. So in the economy and technology, we have big questions about a future of jobs and a future of more self-generated work. Geopolitics. I came from a conference yesterday in Brussels on Geopolitics 4.0. So something's obviously changing in geopolitics. What are we seeing? We hear a lot of talk about the end of the US hegemony and the rise of a multipolar world. A world in which China, the US, the EU, and other countries like Brazil and Russia have a seat at the table and have power and influence. But not just state actors, we have non-state actors. We have cities rising onto the global stage. We had President Trump withdrawing the US from the Paris Agreement at the same time as we had city mayors stepping forward and saying, we will take the US forward in this agreement. So we have non-state actors, for good and bad. We have the rise of Asia. We've seen a shift in the center of economic growth from west to east. The center of gravity of the global economy used to be somewhere around the mid-Atlantic, and now it's somewhere moving towards Central Asia. And we have remilitarization. If you look at NATO's budgets, if you look at what's happening in the Asia-Pacific region, there's more and more spend on military and defense happening. So these trends in geopolitics are increasingly referred to as an increase in tensions within and between countries. So when you look at all these trends, it's quite easy to get up to hundreds of trends very, very quickly, right? Lots of different trends happening in lots of different places of the world around lots of different things: people, planet, technology, economy. So it's easy to become very overwhelmed very quickly. And when you think about the future of your region, you're not just thinking about what would we like our region to look like. You're thinking about what's already happening in our region, what are the trends here? But you're also having to think about, well, what are the trends that are happening more generally in Sweden as well? And then you're also having to think about what are the trends that are happening more across Europe or in the world? Because we're no longer disconnected or isolated. We're connected so much that even at a local or regional level, we have to think about the connections that we have with the country, with the region, and with the world. And those are all shaping and influencing what is happening in this region. And so it becomes, when you start thinking about the trends, you start off with 3, you soon end up with 50, And before you know it, I went into one organisation, they had 287 trends and an analysis on each of them, and absolutely no understanding of what they could do about the future. They became completely paralysed by their analysis. So the future cannot be predicted, but it can be shaped, right? And it's always active. People sometimes tell me that they don't have time to think about the future. The reality is in any decision-making situation, whether it's about what we do with the kids, what we do with grandma, or what I do in the workplace, where in any decision-making situation, the future is always active. It's just often not made explicit, right? And the joy, what I want you to think about today is not just to work with the general future, oh, we're working with the future, but to think explicit, make your future explicit. What is it I'm assuming about the future? And is that really realistic? Is it really valid? Not just to have a general understanding of the future. And the reason we work with the future is if we make the future explicit, testable and contestable, we can make it useful and usable. And if we open up the future, we can design and find and discover more options for action than if we just look at the trends from the past. Now there's an old story about two wolves in a forest. Do you know this story here? So there are two wolves in a forest. One's called hope, the other's called fear. Which one wins? The one you feed. So often when we look at all the trends, we become paralyzed by fear of the future very quickly. So what we have to do is we have to learn to feed the other wolf which increasingly lives in the big data forest. And we have to feed hope, but we have to feed it realistically. And to get to realistic hope, what we're going to do is we're going to shift from knowing the future to learning our way into the future. Let me talk about how we can do that. Navigating the future is a bit of a paradox at the moment. We have an inability to know what the future will be, but we do have an ability to imagine and to create it. And this tension between not being able to know the future, but having the ability to imagine and create it, has actually been one of the evolutionary characteristics of our entire species for 10,000 years. It's just since the scientific enlightenment, we've tended to forget about the imagination and the creation bit. We've put that second place to the scientific part of knowing about it. But in today's fast-paced change, the only way to keep pace with what's going on is to use our capabilities for imagination, conversation, and creativity in order to shape and keep pace with the future. And that's made doubly difficult at the moment because in the long term, our long-term goals are high stakes, right? If we don't achieve them, then it's really bad news. But in the short term, we have huge unpredictability. Even companies these days are not putting out some quarterly returns because they think the future is so unpredictable, they can't even guarantee what they will deliver for the next quarter. So navigating requires a change in approach. Now this, in this diagram, is the most common way that we tend to think about the future, not as individuals, but when we get into the workplace, when we go about our business, when we are professionals. In this approach to the future is called forecasting, and it's based on how can we understand what the future will be with some degree of confidence. What will happen in the future that we need to plan for? And in forecasting, we look at the trends, we get to the facts. The facts are based on evidence of the past. We have some form of quantitative model. We calculate, we put in the trends, and then we project forward and we say, this is what the future will look like. And forecasting in the English dictionary means to take the past and throw it forward as the future. So even when you're forecasting, throwing the future forward, what you're actually doing is this. You're walking backwards into the future, looking at the past, right? So forecasting is actually retrospective. It's not anything about the future. It's about the continued push of the past. Now these are examples of forecasts. I'm sure you've seen this type of analysis before. One of these is for oil price, and one of these is for global GDP growth. One's produced by a consensus economics group, and the other is produced by the International Monetary Fund. These are the professionals who should know the future, right? And what you see, the black lines on all these charts are the actual trends that were measured, what actually happened. And the multicolored things you see are the changes that they make all the time to the forecasts about what they're getting right and what they're getting wrong. And what we notice from this, if you look at these trends, the black lines, you see the colored lines always come off to carry forward whatever the direction is at the time, right? And forecasting has an inbuilt trap because it always continues what's happening in the present, right, from the past. It's always about continuing the future based on what has happened in the past. So when we're forecasting, this is what we're doing. We're understanding this black line of what's happened. That's what the data gives us. It lets us know what has happened and what we can measure. And then we're throwing it forward and we're ending up with these three different types of lines. One of these we call the baseline. It's what we think is our most confidence guesstimate of what the future will be. Some of us will put probabilities on that. Then we usually have something called the upper or the higher case, and we have something called the lower or the worst case. So in forecasting, we usually have three futures. Business as usual, best guess. Higher case, lower case. Worst case, upper case, whatever you want to call them. Sometimes these are called scenarios. That confuses them with another practice. But this is what we do when we're forecasting. And what we're assuming is that the future has already happened because it's in the past. What we're assuming is that any form of uncertainty can be converted into quantifiable and manageable risk. And what we're assuming is that everything that has been invented, everything that could be invented, has already been invented. So forecasting is essential. We can't do without it, but it's not enough if we want to really shape and prepare for our future. This is what happens if you only rely on forecasting. This was the run-up to the great financial crisis in 2008. The bar charts in orange and red show what is the best consensus economic forecast of the OECD in May 2008. This is just 6 months before the crisis really hits in full. Just 6 months. And this is the OECD consensus forecast, which is put together by talking to at least 1,800 PhD economists all across the world who sit in governments and in businesses. This is the best guess you're ever going to get. And governments use this to plan, right? What you see in the orange bars are what they said would happen. The red bars are what happened. What do you notice? Were they sort of right? What was happening in Finland? I mean, this is when forecasting gets it wrong. It gets it really, really wrong, right? So it's not just a question of the forecast could be out a bit. It's the fact that the forecast can be fatal. If you plan with the orange bar and you end up in the red space, it's a really devastating place to be. That's what we found out in 2008. And the challenge is, I mean, it's not just economists. Let's not just pick on economists. Anybody who just relies on forecasting is making assumptions that nothing is really going to change. And yet we live in a world where we know that everything seems to be changing. So forecasting is a guide, but not enough to use as a basis for futures thinking. So we have to shift from knowing the future by relying on forecasts to learning our way into the future in what we call, and I call, a tuna world. And tuna stands for turbulence, unpredictable uncertainty, novelty, and ambiguity. Turbulence. You've been on an aeroplane. If you're like me, it's usually when you're flying over India and suddenly you hit an air pocket. And you know that feeling when the plane just goes, poof, right? Your stomach comes up through your mouth. And that's turbulence. Turbulence isn't it's gone a little bit up or a little bit down. It's that the very ground beneath us seems to have disappeared, right? That's a turbulent change, and we're seeing more of them in markets, and we're seeing more of them in societies. Not simple up or down movements, but complete floor movements. Right. Unpredictable uncertainty. Economists in 1930 invented a term called radical uncertainty. But they keep using the word uncertainty. Now they've put the word deep uncertainty under it to contrast it with normal uncertainty. So if you have a variation, you've got a group of children in a school, in a class, they're all different heights. And if you stand them in order of heights, you'll get a distribution. Yeah, there'll be some small ones, there'll be a lot in the middle, medium-sized ones, and there'll be a few very tall ones, right? And this is called the bell curve. It's a Gaussian distribution. And when we're forecasting, we use the assumption that that distribution is everywhere. And we have something called standard deviations, right? And a standard deviation means there's the average height of the class, and then if you go out one standard deviation, you'll get 66% of the children in that height range. And if you go out 2, you'll get 97, and if you go out 3, all the class will fit into that range. Yeah, that's what we use for how we manage uncertainty. But in today's world, we're not finding bell curves anymore. We're finding curves that have got what called long tails, right? Or bipolar distributions. If you look at equality or income distributions, we have a very few people with extremely high incomes, and then we have a lot of people with no incomes, and we have very few people or fewer and fewer people in the middle. So we have a double hump then. And if you think about averaging that out, it looks like it's okay for everybody, but actually it's lousy for everyone, right? So that's unpredictable uncertainty. Ambiguity. Ambiguity comes about because when even we have so much information that even when really good experts look at the same piece of data, they can disagree about what it means. And even if you bring more data to bear, it doesn't resolve the disagreement. So ambiguity is the fact that we live in this world where there are multiple perspectives which are really relevant and can't be reduced through analysis and data. There's always more than one way of looking at the future. And novelty, right? Novelty is unprecedented in human experience. So we now are living with things like our grandparents did, but increasingly so, that have no history of human experience. And that makes forecasting really difficult because we've got no data in the past. We've got no statistics. We've got no evidence base. So imagine you explaining to your grandparents what the mobile phone would have been like. And now we're trying to think about what new technologies will bring. And we don't even have the words to describe them today in terms of what they will mean for us as societies. So we see a lot of hype and hope and horror around things like robotics and artificial intelligence. And we have this real lack of understanding and inability to think about what these new technologies will mean to us, not just individually, but as a society. So this is a tuna world. It's not a linear forecasting world. And in a tuna world, you have to take a different approach to the future, of learning our way into the future. And we do that by working with more than one future, but not too many futures, right? More than one, but not too many. So more than one, but not 1,000. More than one, but not even 10. More than one, possibly 2 or 3, right? Maybe 4. But if you have 7 futures on the table, you can't work with them. It's overwhelming, right? So we have to find a way of working with more than one, but not too many. And this is where Foresight and Futures have spent the last 60 years trying to work out how do we get to working with a small, manageable, and memorable number of futures rather than just one or too many. And that's the difference between forecasting, futures, and foresight. Is futures and foresight work with the ability to use more than one future to prepare and more than one future to think about what the future could be. Now, there's many different ways you can go about in the futures and foresight space, different methods. There's a whole diverse toolkit. If you're a forecaster, you've got a hammer. Everything has to look like a nail. If you're a foresighter, you've got a whole toolkit, and your job is to be able to use those different tools for different jobs. Not everything's a hammer. Use a screwdriver when you need it, right? There's a diversity of tools. These tools have very exotic names like horizon scanning, megatrends analysis, scenario planning, and visioning and backcasting. And in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen what I would call the rise of design futures, and they have particularly come out of the Nordic countries into the world, right? So I'm going to talk through these and give you some examples of each of them. And I think that when you're going through your process, you should be thinking about how can we use more than one of these, and where is it appropriate to use them? Because they all have, like a toolkit, they can all be used for good jobs, but they have different purposes. So, megatrends. A megatrends analysis is, again, working with the push from the past, but unlike a forecast, it's not a single trend. In a megatrend analysis, we're trying to think about what does the interaction of trends mean in terms of pattern shifts, right? Not what is a single line to the future, but what patterns are changing and how are they changing? And an example of that would be demographic aging. I gave you the example of aging in Japan earlier. Well, here we can see the pattern, how it's changing, right? This is the diagram. This is, in Japan, people have been getting older for decades. But what we've seen is a demographic pattern shift. It used to be, you see this triangular shape, the pyramid, that was called. Then it became this middle bit, and that's called the pig in the python. It's like the fat lump in the middle. And now it's called the chimney. You can see those different patterns. It's gone from triangle, pig in a python, to chimney stack. And this is a fundamental pattern shift in demography. And what it does is it impacts every facet of policy or life or planning. It's not a single trend that you can nicely put in a box and contain it. It goes everywhere. It has huge implications. So in megatrends analysis, we're looking for what is being connected in terms of the trends and the policies we're taking. And we see in demographic aging can be explained not by a single trend, but by the interaction of trends and policies in health improvements, in social care, in fertility, in longevity, lots of different things coming in together. Right, here is the OECD. OECD uses a megatrends framework. It's called the 5 Ps framework. Because there are so many different trends, you have to start inventing a framework that is memorable for working with these different trends and working out how you bring trends together to create a story of a pattern shift. So, like I showed you before, people, planet, productivity, which is technology and environment, geopolity, and also we have a category called progress. So there's a very simple mnemonic for remembering them, and each of these categories has a whole host of other trends in them, and you look at those trends and say, what's the story here of the pattern shift? How would we explain the pattern shift of people? And I gave you a story before that said, we have societies which are being shaped both by more aging and more urbanization, and the world's becoming more socially complex. That's the pattern shift. Would you like to see the megatrends? Let me see if I can get this video working. There we go.
What will our world look like in 2050? What are the global megatrends shaping our future? People. Extreme poverty is declining. GDP per capita is rising, although so too is inequality. Life expectancy continues to increase. The global population is set to grow by 1/3 over the next 35 years, while the share of people aged over 85 will triple. We are becoming more urban. By 2050, 2.8 billion more people will live in cities. Already today, we have 22 megacities with over 10 million inhabitants. This will potentially bring new social divides, as well as health and environmental challenges. We are becoming more connected through internet and mobile technology, and this is bringing demands for greater transparency and accountability. Planet. Human activity is accelerating climate change. Unless we take collective action now to change our systems of production and consumption, within 15 years, half the global population will be living in areas of high water stress. Within 25 years, energy demand will rise by more than a third. And within 35 years, we will need to double the amount of food we produce. Productivity. Technological progress fuels economic growth. Major new technologies which disrupt existing systems could represent an additional $33 trillion over the next 10 years. But currently, global productivity and the diffusion of innovation have slowed. Large groups of the world's population are being left behind. The global economic balance is shifting south and east. By 2050, Asia will account for half of global GDP, while half of global trade will be between non-OECD countries. We also risk living in an increasingly unequal world. The average income of the richest 10% of the population is 10 times that of the poorest 10% across the OECD. 10 to 1, up from 7 to 1 in the 1980s. Geopolity. These megatrends are impacting our politics and policy decisions. Increasingly, interconnected economies are finding new ways to collaborate, but global challenges have also become more intertwined. Adding to the complexity of global challenges are new non-state actors, foundations, cities, transnational corporations, civil society, but also well-financed and organised terrorist groups. There is also less trust in authority than in the recent past. Only 1 in 4 citizens say they trust their government. As policymakers face new risks and challenges, they are also developing ways to collaborate through new international cooperation configurations. They are confronting new questions. What do these complex changes mean for the multilateral system? Is the status quo a viable option? Is the power of the state shifting or fading in the presence of new actors? What do megatrends tell us about the multilateral agenda to 2020 and beyond? New approaches may be needed to turn the policy rudder and avoid potential icebergs ahead. Better policies are required, not just for better lives today, but more than ever for the decades to come. What seeds can we plant today to provide better possibilities for our future?
Okay, so there's an example of taking a whole lot of trends and creating a set of storylines that help us think about big questions around the future. And that type of presentation is followed by a series of breakout conversations about what does this mean and what would we do for it. So in a megatrends, we start off with taking all the individual trends, we bind them together and create a story of the future. And we go through a process of asking, what if this future happens? When will it happen? And what does it mean? What would be its impact? And then we say, if that's the impact, what are the implications? And if those are the implications, what should we be doing about it? And who should be doing it? Right? Standard planning process once you get out the other end. But you're just starting off with a broader and richer set of insights. And you can use the megatrends analysis to ask big questions that are currently around. There's a riddle of work and income. Do we need to redesign the social contract? Do we need to measure productivity differently? Are some of the questions governments are asking. Democracy is fatigued. Is there a new shape of global governance which isn't just local or national, but actually is somehow much more engaging of young, the disenfranchised, and everybody. People are talking about how do we regulate new technology choices. So they're looking at how do these things combine. Can technology, I came from a conference yesterday which was about geopolitics, and the fundamental driver of geopolitics at the moment is technology. And so what are the choices we really need to be making about technologies, and how do we make them when we don't really have never experienced them and we don't know what they mean? So a megatrends analysis takes that push of the past, like forecasting, but winds it into a set of stories, and then you use those stories to ask better questions and address them and find new and different options for action. Let's talk about scenario planning. It does a similar thing, but it does it by having a much more structured approach to stories. So in scenario planning, we try and work with 2 or 3 memorable stories of plausible future contexts that might happen to us whether we want them to or not, right? So we're not forecasting what will happen, and we're not thinking about what we would like to happen, but again, we're trying to work out what might happen and what would we need to do to prepare for what might happen. And so we're rehearsing, in effect, a what if to avoid an if only regret. Now here's an example of a set of scenarios on the future of energy. I work also as a senior director of the World Energy Council in London. So we've produced 3 stories of the future of energy from a consultation process that is global, right? We have 99 different member countries, and we have thousands of people involved in a conversation. And we get them to produce a set of, out of all their conversations, 3 stories of what might be happening in energy that takes into account what they think is certain and what they think is uncertain about changes. And we end up with 3 stories. These are called modern jazz, unfinished symphony, and hard rock. In the world of modern jazz, we still have market-driven approaches, right? We've got a lot of market mechanisms, we've got a lot of technology innovation, we've got much more energy access for all, we've got the market playing a much more active part, enabling more efficient access to renewables and much more community-based energy systems. In the world of unfinished symphony, we have a government-driven approach to achieving sustainability. We've got states around the world working as a community of nations, addressing climate change together, decarbonising the system through regulation. And in hard rock, we've got neither the market nor the state really stepping up to take leadership. And what we have is a mess. And in that mess, we have the usual response, which is that in times of stress, people innovate. So in a hard rock world, we do see innovation and change, but it's much more localized and much more fragmented. There's much less international community bang for your buck in that scenario. Now, these stories tell us a little bit about what we are assuming is predetermined about the future and what we think is critical but uncertain. So these stories are built on 4 predetermined changes. That is, between now and 2060, we assume global population growth will slow down, that there will be a range of new technologies, that we will appreciate planetary boundaries and respond to them increasingly, so it's not a bad, the environment goes to hell world, and that there will be a continued shift in power from Europe and the US to Asia, economically and politically. The uncertainties are really about the pace of technology change, the emphasis on environmental policies, the uptake of new technologies. Those are the big uncertainties. And we get from that this sort of understanding of how the future might branch out in different directions. And when you're working with scenarios, the aim is not to work out which one of these is right or which one of these we like. The aim is to keep them at the table and to use all of them at the same time and ask ourselves, what would we do if we ended up in the world of hard rock, right? Because it's not a world we would choose, but it's a world that could still happen. What would we do? And how would that be different than if we ended up in a world of unfinished symphony or a world of modern jazz? How do our options change in each of those futures? How do our strengths change in each of those futures? The OECD similarly has done a set of scenarios on the shape of new global governance. So to give you a flavour of what the stories in a set of scenarios look like, I have another video. So these are from 2014, and the conversation at the OECD, this is a ministerial level conversation, was on the future investment and jobs. And the question was, how do we prepare for a world where it seems we have low investment and we seem to have disappearing jobs? What do we have to think about in terms of how the international community might work together? What types of international community might we see? This is what these scenarios address.
Today's world still shares much of the DNA of 2015. The global financial system remains in place, but an ever-increasing emphasis on short-term gains has increased the risks of asset bubbles. A winner-takes-all mentality still dominates many economies. Though most countries are experiencing slow, jobless growth at all skill levels, and as social support programs are squeezed and transformed, the demands for change grow louder. Consumption continues to outpace increased resource efficiency, driving up food, water, and energy prices, increasing pressures on local ecosystems, and speeding up environmental degradation. Feedback from big data analytics has delivered a more efficient, transparent, and accountable world. But frustration at governments' inability to react and evolve quickly, and the sheer amount of inertia and corruption in the system discourages citizens from investing the time and energy necessary to effect structural change. Technology has empowered the talented, but the unskilled and elderly feel increasingly disenfranchised and unheard, despite their now only being taxed on what they consume. Hurriedly assembled patchwork solutions have so far prevented a catastrophic collapse. But it's increasingly clear our global systems are lagging far behind our global reality. Our post-1945 vision of one interconnected world has instead become more dynamic, with nations settling into three main groups. The first, aging winner-takes-all market states, have open societies committed to green growth and individual well-being. The second, more cautious, less open economies focus on social stability and inclusiveness, while the remainder pragmatically evolve their policies to attract aid and investment from the other two. As this new reality delivers better value for more people, the old global order has shrunk to a small common space, while more volatile states on the fringes promote a values-based alternative to secular capitalism. But as these groups evolve to better serve their internal markets, their financial systems and institutions move further apart, and international disagreements regularly flare up over technology choices and common goods disputes, including AI and intellectual property rights. This new tripartite world has made global trade and business more complex. But in diversifying our solutions to challenges, it has also created a more robust, resilient, and human-scale model for the future. While national governments continue to provide defense and other state-level responsibilities, well-run cities connected by digital bridges have become the drivers of the world economy. A combination of strong governance and effective taxation, energy, water, and food self-sufficiency, and full transparency and accountability have attracted substantial long-term private investments and made these cities a desirable location for citizens, including millions of rural migrants. Less successful cities have become gridlocked by aging infrastructure, or caught in an ever steeper downward spiral of ineffective governance, corruption, and environmental and social problems. Drought-stricken cities have become ungovernable, while many on the coast suffer regular floods. And though some famous cities have declined in influence, others have created a colorful cultural economy. Robots have taken over many jobs, But a 3D printing revolution and a return to localized craftsmanship has triggered a boom in the do-it-yourself economy, creating strong circular microeconomies. As the most successful cities continue to evolve, opportunities exist to build better bridges and for national governments to adopt policies that support their dynamic growth and encourage weaker cities to follow their example.
So, a set of scenarios. These stories all started in the future. They are pulling us. They're pulling the future into the present rather than the megatrends which was pushing us from the past. And you don't ever present scenarios back to back. You usually give one and have a conversation about it and then start with another one. Otherwise, you lose track of them. There's also another saying in the world of foresight, and that is, there's nothing so boring as somebody else's scenarios. So the rule of thumb is build your own, right? And they're much more interesting. So everybody else's stuff is really boring. So these three scenarios, city power, multipolar, and quick fixes, are designed particularly for the member states of the OECD. So they're designed for national government representatives, and they're designed to challenge their thinking about the future is either weaker multilateralism or stronger multilateralism. It starts having the conversation about what do we really mean about the different shapes of global governance that are possible, and who will lead the global agenda? Will it be cities, or will it be nation states, or a combination? So they're designed for a purpose and a use, and for a particular user. So when you build your own scenarios, if you do, you don't try and imitate somebody else's. You think, what are the issues we need to think about, and what do our stories tell us, and how will we use those stories to discover new options, to address big questions, and to think about the future that might happen to us, whether or not we would want it to. The third area of methods I'm going to talk about are normative methods. So we started off with megatrends, which were about possible futures. We moved to scenarios which were about plausible futures, alternatives. And we're moving on to what I would call visioning and design futures, which are preferable futures. What would we prefer the future to be? What would we like it to be? This is about what's our vision of the future. So when we're working with these methods, we're guided by a sense of what is good or what is bad. They're normative. We're making judgments about the future is going to be better, and how do we describe what better looks like? How do we create a meaningful betterness? Not just our own sense of it, but something that's shared with everyone else. So in visioning and in design futures work, we are in effect implementing the imaginable. We're imagining a future, and then we're going to translate that future into reality. So vision into action is the creed of normative futures. And now in normative futures, rather than having those straight lines just going forward, in normative futures we start off with a sense of, well, the current situation is lousy and things could be better. There's some form of motivation that actually things are not good now and we need to change them. Or things are good, but they could be even better. There is a sense somewhere that things need to change and can be better. And what we do in visioning and design futures, we don't start off by saying, well, where would the trends take us, or what are the scenarios? We start off with a leap of imagination. And we say, well, let's imagine what better looks like. Let's describe it, right? Let's think about what better looks like. And then let's work out, if that's what better looks like, and this is where we are, here, how do we move from better back to here? What would we need to do if better is 2030? What would we need to do from 2025 to 2030 to get there? And we keep coming back. And that's a process called backcasting. So we take an imaginative leap of a better future, and then we work out, using that future, how to close the gap between today and that ideal design. That's visioning and backcasting. The other method in normative futures is called design futures. And in design futures, you're prototyping. You're not trying to, you still imagine something that's better. It might not be quite as big vision better. And you're trying to think, and then you start building something and testing and using it, prototyping it all the time, right? So we go iPhone 1, iPhone 10. Apparently they're getting better with each version. You know, I'm probably of an age group where iPhone 1 will still do me. But the concept is, in design, is you don't just imagine it, you build it. And you use the building of it to understand what better looks like, and you keep improving it. Okay? So here is an example. Slovenia has been through a national visioning exercise in the last couple of years. It's been through strategic visioning exercises in the past in the country, but they were always done by the government for the people. But 2 years ago, they did something remarkable. They did a whole-of-society visioning exercise. They engaged with citizens and stakeholders, experts in academia, and they said, let's open up the future. Because we've done everything we set out to achieve since we were founded. We've joined the EU. We've become a member of some international organizations. We're now a teenager in country terms, and we don't know what we want to be when we grow up. So we have to start thinking, what's our vision of ourselves in the future? And they went through this exercise, and they took 2050, a really ambitious future target, but they took it because they wanted to be 2 generations out from where they were. They wanted to have that much space for change. And they said, what does this future look like in 2050? What do we want to be? And then how do we get there? And in thinking about how they get there, they said, we can't just think about what we want to do. We have to think about what everybody else is doing and what might get in the way of how we make progress. So they took this great big vision, and then they started strategic planning by saying, how do we get there, and what will try and stop us getting there? And they built that into their plan. And what they were doing is this type of process. This is a vision into action framework, and it's an interactive framework because it just doesn't go in one direction. You start off with this big ambition, your guiding star. It's completely unrealistic. A vision is unrealistic. It's ambitious. If it was realistic, it wouldn't be a vision. It would be a goal, right? So it's out there, like a star. We don't expect to achieve it, but it gives us direction. And then they have a conversation about, what will it take to get there? What are the big, hairy, audacious goals we've got to achieve? What's going to be the breakthrough that gets us from the direction we're going in now to this different direction that's better? And then they have to think about the chessboard. If that's where we need to get to, and those are the goals we want to achieve, what else is going to stop us getting there? What are the disruptors? What are the trends? What are the actions other people are doing? What are the scenarios we need to think about? And then they think about, and where we stand in the present, how do we start? So they move through a process of star, to climbing mountains, to navigating a chessboard, to standing firmly in the present, and they're working through time all the time. So the vision hasn't come up. So they do Vision 2050, Goals 2030, and then they do Action Plan 2022, right? It's a 5-year plan. And their plan changes every year, but their vision, their direction doesn't. So the vision provides the guiding star, and the strategy is changing all the time. The second way of thinking about vision into action and learning our way into the future are these 2 examples that come from almost 10 centuries apart in human history. I'm going to end with this. This is my... So what this is the top one is the Cathedral of Chartres. Has anyone been to the Cathedral of Chartres in France? Okay. Built in the 11th century. And the bottom one is something called the Higgs boson experiment, which was the experiment in particle physics to prove that there was something called the God particle, which is a fundamental physics piece. But all I want you to know is we're going from medieval to state-of-the-art of science, right? So I'm going to pick 2 examples that describe exactly the same principle of learning our way into the future. The Cathedral of Chartres was built before we had architecture, before we had modern tools. What we had were craftspeople, each practiced in their own toolkit, who had to build something to the glory of a common vision, a glory of God, and nobody knew what it would look like. They had no idea what this thing would look like at the finish. And in fact, they couldn't build it in their own lifetime. It took centuries. And the roof fell off a few times, and a couple of the columns fell down. But what they were doing all the time is they were guided by this common goal, a diversity of different skills, and a continuous conversation of, are we getting there? How do we make it work? What's changing? We tend to think, we might think that's very old-fashioned, but if we come to the Higgs boson experiment, state-of-the-art particle physics, they won the Nobel Prize for this year. When they first imagined that there could be a future in which we have something called a God particle, I won't describe the fundamental concept. They were thought that people in the community, the rest of the science community, thought they were bonkers. They told them they were mad. They told them that you couldn't possibly think that way. That was not the proper way to think about the universe. They spent 20 years trying to work out, okay, so we've imagined something and we think it's very powerful, but we don't know how to prove it. There's no science that proves it. They spent 20 years working on developing the science. They spent another 20 years working on how to conduct an experiment. And they in something like 2015, they ran their experiment 40 years after their original idea. 40 years of prototyping, how do we even start to demonstrate that this is a real idea? And they won the Nobel Prize for it because it was real. And both these examples show us that actually what we are is pulled from the future. What we can do is use many different methods. And we can shape the future, we can create it by using many different methods and working together. And that's the process I think you're about to go through. It's not about accepting the trends. It is about achieving your own destiny. And it is about working with more than one, but not too many different futures. So, let me end. Foresight is not about what we can know about the future. It's how we make and shape our common destiny. The principles of those two wolves in the forest, hope and fear, to feed realistic hope, there are 5 principles. You have to think about the whole system, the bigger picture. You have to think about creativity from inclusiveness, which means bring people on board who disagree with you or are very different, because innovation happens between difference, not the same. Collaborate. Experiment. Don't try and get the future right. You'll never get it right. Use the future to find a place to start and prototype. And learn with futures, more than one, not just with one. As practitioners, it means working with a diverse toolkit, just like the guys in Chartres or the Higgs boson. About designing purposefully, what do we want to use the future to do together? Which futures do we need to use together to achieve our regional development ambitions? And there's no best or right method, right? And what it takes from each of us as leaders is to be bold, to be courageous, and to be humble. Because societies today are not looking for leaders who will tell them what the future will be. They're looking for leaders who will help them realize and enable their future. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very, very much. I will not try to sum this up because it's very complex and very mind-blowing, because it's, well, you have to free yourself from a lot of things we usually do in our working day. And I have 40 hours working week. How much do you think I should spend on the future?
Okay, good question. What I tend to do when I go into organizations is people tell me that if you're a leader or you're leading a project, we're all leaders in some part of our life. Leaders are supposed to think about the future, right? A good leader is about, if they have to think about the future to make a difficult decision under uncertainty, but a great leader is somebody who uses the future, right? So if we want to be great leaders. So I go into organizations and I say, how much time do you spend looking at the future? Because you're the leaders, right? And they tell me, oh, we spend all our time in the future, right? We're just always doing the future stuff. So then you go through and you say, let's analyze this. I'm working a 40-hour week. I can't possibly spend any more time. And then you look at it and you find out they're not actually looking at the future at all. They're living in the past. They're usually firefighting. They're dealing with something that's already happened. Or they're using trends, so they're projecting the future. And my deal with them is, let's see if I can help you spend 10% of your time in the future at the end of this process. We'll just start with 2%, right? So all I'll ask you for is, on one of your agendas, clear the space and have a conversation about the future, just for a 10th of your agenda, right?
Yeah.
And the difference is phenomenal.
Yes, I can understand that. Good tip, right? Some questions for Angela. We will pick it up. We'll go around you, the audience, and you have to speak in the microphone. Där. Får gärna säga vem du är. Där. Sådär. Jo då, den kommer.
Ja, den kommer. Torbjörn Minde. I was thinking about indication of the scenarios. You didn't talk much about that. Is that something you don't promote, or is that something you indication, your measurement, or indication of scenarios, of futures?
Yeah, so my job today was to try and get you to understand there are different methods rather than depth in each of them. So in a scenario planning process, normally when you've built a set of scenarios, you start using them, but at the same time you start tracking and monitoring them. So you're looking out all the time for signals that tell you, that either confirm that you've got the right set, or particularly signals that might disconfirm them and make you think you need a different set of scenarios. That's the humility part. That we don't work with a set of scenarios and assume we've got the right ones. We use them, and at the same time we monitor and track to see if they're still relevant and or plausible.
Some other question?
One here. Hello, my name is Adam Wickstrom. Do you think people will be more or less prone to sort of fall into line with suggestions from authorities in the future?
Well, as a foresight practitioner, I would say, what will authority mean in the future? What will it look like? What shape will it take? And will it be the same sort of authority we're thinking of today, top down? Or will it be more peer-to-peer? Will it be shaped by dynamics? So I don't have my job as a foresight practitioner isn't to give you a definitive answer. It's to facilitate your thinking and to ask you, why is that question important? How do we ask the question in the right way? How do we open up the future to find better ways of addressing whatever the challenge is that brings that question to the fore for you? So what do you think?
I don't know. I think I can see it going both ways. People want to be guided by authorities on climate, for example. On the other hand, people seem to sort of be more and more single grouped against each other. It's I don't know what to think.
You could just shout.
Yeah, I could do that, yes. Thank you for a nice talk. My name is Stina Almqvist, and I was wondering, in Sweden we talk a lot about psykisk ohälsa, psychology, unhealth, mental illness that is growing around the population, both younger and older people. And you don't talk about that so much, and I was wondering, do you see that as a global phenomenon because of the stress, or how do you address this in your research? It's a fear question, and I hope you have the hope answer.
Well, it's impossible to put if you put a comprehensive set of trends out, right? It's incomprehensible. That was what I was trying to say. So I can find the trends for you that will say mental stress and mental health issues and mental health incidents are on the increase. That's pretty prevalent in many Western societies, right? So that's out there. So is the whole stuff in the US about the addiction to painkillers and opiates and stuff like that. So there's a lot of shift in the health and the mental health space. So the question is if that's really our challenge, if that's the challenge we want to address, what we want to know is what is leading to that? What are the things that are driving and shaping that? And what different directions might that play out in? And then how do we use that combination of the push of the past and the possibilities of the future to open up the present space of solutions and think differently than we were about why this problem is there and what we might do about it? So that's what we try and do. So I haven't mentioned it simply because it would be in the 4,000 trends box piece. Is it important? Fundamentally.
Yeah. And do you see, as I said, it's a common issue in Sweden, but have you picked it up from other countries as well, or?
Well, I first picked up that trend in around, and I'm not a futurologist, I was just working with people who were doing scenarios. We picked it up in 1998 as something called the quarter-life crisis in the US. The fact that people were coming through universities, having a huge amount of success, and when they hit the age of 25, were failing for the first time, and it was completely wiping them out. They had no mechanisms for coping with failure. And we see a lot of these, people are telling us this stress comes from IT, this stress comes from the pace of change, that this stress comes from the separation of mind and body that is practiced in health. So there are many different people who will claim they know why this problem is there, and they have the solution. My job is to get them round the table and start thinking together and learning from each other so that actually we can consider real ways of intervening.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, you're all very quiet. Yeah. Come on.
Perhaps do we have some questions from
online?
The net, online?
Or particularly from the people who are only here for a free lunch.
No questions from online.
Okay. Go on. I can hear you. It's whether the people online can hear you. So let me come closer to you. Then you... Okay.
Okay, my name is Carolina. I work for Trygghetsrådet. I think a lot of people here knows what we do. We're actually working with people having to face a new future of them. People that's leaving a work life they have been having for a long time, and they are faced with the fact of looking for a new job. So I was thinking this is very global that you've been talking about, but we can actually use it for ourselves as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I was thinking, which of these ways do you prefer to work with yourself when you are predicting your future?
Okay. So I don't predict my future. I do try and shape it all the time. And a little mix of all of them. I mean, I'm a bit like, my kids will tell you that that their mother is not a planner, which is ironic. We're like the cobbler whose children don't have shoes. It's like that in our household. So you use a mix of all of them, right? So if I was looking at the situation you're saying, people who've come out of, they didn't expect to be made redundant and suddenly they find themselves disconnected and looking for a job, I would say they're probably not just looking for a job, they're looking for a meaning, an identity. Work is not just about money. It's about sense of purpose, belonging of community. And when we lose our jobs, we lose many different connections. So we always try and think about what's the whole system shift that's going on around that individual. And then we start thinking about if that's the whole system of changes that's happening, what does that tell us about the different ways the context is impacting that? And how can we think about the different contexts in which we can find different opportunities. So the challenge of losing your job, in my experience, is not that people lose their money. It's that they lose. It's almost like they go through a death experience. And so it's that you need a therapeutic intervention which has a positive psychology in it. And that means helping them think about how they can still shape and create their future, which in many different spheres of their life. And, you know, it's not just about, even if they find another a job, there's still community building to do. So that would be my intervention. It would be more therapeutic, positive psychology, and working with people to understand that the loss is not just their income, it's the search for meaning and community.
Thank you. And I think that we are working in that way. We have a saying in Sweden that's in English would be called, you have to aim for the stars and you can reach the treetops.
So that's vision into action.
Yeah. So I really like that kind of
and the challenge in vision to action is not just to think positive, it's to think smart. So to think about what are the things that will get in your way or what you actually have to do. So realistic for hope for me isn't a lottery ticket that you clutch on the sofa waiting to win. It's an axe that you use to break down reality and create something else. So vision into action is action. So if this has seemed very global and abstract, it's just I've come in with examples because I've been trying to give you the bigger picture, but you can use all of this. You have trends, you have scenarios, you have visions, you have forecasts. It's just handy to know and challenge yourself to think, is there more than one way of thinking about this situation by thinking about it from the future, rather than thinking that this situation only leads us in one direction? I hope that's helpful. And it's a lot, but there's a little primer put out by the European Commission now that you can download. And it's just got all these different methods in. And I understand it's now in the colours that you use for this region. So how fortuitous.
Thank you very much, Angela.
You're welcome.
We had some comments from our Facebook page, and they said it was a very exciting talk and speech, and also that it was mind-blowing. It gave them a lot of new thoughts. So they are watching.
Fantastic.
This is a gift from us to you, and it's a little piece of Norrbotten, which will hopefully taste good.
Oh, wow.
Yes, and I made some notes during your speech, and it, maybe it's something that you could think about during the lunch, because it's time to eat now. What great changes are you preparing for? In our few little hours of the week, this is maybe something we can do actually to, as you said, bring that little future into our everyday.
Absolutely, I think so.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.